Hello everyone, in this video I will show you how to combine random flow with panel cutter. So we can generate the random lines or patterns using marked sharp edges using random flow, and then generate the extrusions using panel cutter. Let me just mirror the work mesh using creative flow auto mirror. Click on the area you want mirrored. This will be the real geometry. You will have the 3D axis here that will color up once you press XYZ or 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3 represents XYZ. And if you look over to the 3D axis, X, Y, and Z is equals to RGB. So X is red, Y is green, and blue is Z or Z. Okay, so let me just mirror this in the XYZ axis. 1, 2, 3. You can also press XYZ if you want, and press space to confirm. Now we have this geometry, and I'm just going to use random panels. Okay, so select the faces that you want randomized. In this case, all of the faces. And then in random panels, I'm going to use the square 100% even depth preset, and you can see there's no pattern yet. That is because every preset in the add-on starts with 0 subdivision. In case that you have a substantially more faces in your work mesh, then you can already see patterns showing up even if you don't have the subdivision increased to 1 here. So in this case, since we have a really low poly mesh or work mesh, we need to increase the subdivision to create patterns. If you have, or if you do have increased subdivision or not increased subdivision or increased starting resolution, then you need to be more careful with the subdivision that you are using. So in this case, I'm just going to turn the uniform depth so I can see the patterns. I don't need the extrusions using the random flow. The extrusion depth will be generated using the panel cutter add-on. So I'm just going to use the uniform depth toggle here. That will allow us to see the pattern better. So you can play around with the seed value and then the panel size. Panel size means one minimum or minimum of one face per island and maximum of 30 faces per island. So I'm just going to increase this to 5 and just play around with seed value until I get something that looks usable to me. Okay, so now we have the pattern. And in order to generate these patterns as mark sharp edges, we need to go to mark only right here. And we can use new mesh or merge. New mesh will generate a new mesh and leave the work mesh untouched. So you can just press Shift H and this will show you the new mesh right here, which is cube R panel with the subdivision and the generated pattern. Okay, so let me just undo that and repeat the action. Set this to off and let's try and look for the pattern again. This actually looks good. So let's try this one. And this time we're going to use the merge. Merge means the work mesh will be subdivided and the mark sharp edges generated there. So this is a destructive method, unlike the non-destructive option, which is the new mesh. So if we merge this to the work mesh, you can see that we have the subdivision here and also the marked sharp edges. Now we can uh, continue using this option, for example, and then go to panel cutter. And in panel cut, I'm going to use the node option in the type, which is the new feature in the latest update. And this will generate extrusions from the islands generated using the marked sharp edges boundaries, like this one. So we can go here in the modifier tab after confirming the operation. We can still actually modify the parameters because this is GeoNode based. And that functionality comes with a lot of, or a couple of modifiers, mainly the panel cutter GeoNode system. We have the mirror modifier. This is also a GeoNode system, the clip mirror, which allows you to clip the faces from the center of the mirror. So if we toggle this off, you can see that there are center faces in the clipped area in the symmetry line. If we turn this on, it will get rid of those. So the clip mirror modifier needs to be at the bottom of the mirror modifier. And then we have the bevel. The bevel just makes sure that um, the separation between the panel islands are more obvious. If we turn this off, the separation line here is not clearly visible. And if we turn this on, then now you can clearly see their separation line. Okay, so in this case, we can use the random mode and just play around with the seed value. You can manipulate the minimum offset and maximum offset right here. And it will randomize between those values. So distance here means the merge distance for the doubles. If we use 0 and apply all these modifiers, you can see that the mesh is composed of separate islands because they are not merged. And if we undo the operation and then set this back to its default value, then apply all the modifiers. And if we use the L hat key to select the face island or face groups, you can see that this is now Unimesh. Everything is connected because we get rid of the doubles. Okay, now let's undo that. And with this method, let's select all the faces here. With this method, you can go back to random panels. Do not use subdivision because we have already subdivided the work mesh. We already have the necessary faces for the amount of details that are generating these extrusions here or pattern here, unless you want to increase the subdivision. And keep the merge on, and then you can just play around with the panel seed. And everything is non-destructive. All the extrusion depth is generated using the panel cutter GeoNode system. All we're doing is changing the pattern of the mark sharp edges using the random panels operator in random flow, as you can see here. And we can also go to vertex color. However, this will not work with random panels anymore because you need specific vertex color for the different face islands or face groups. So the term panel islands that you can read in the online documentation, and also you can hear in my listening to my videos here in YouTube, they all mean the same: face groups, face islands, or panel islands. They all represent these faces here that are extruded, and they need to be contiguous, meaning that you don't leave a gap. So if we remove the mark sharp status of that edge, you can see that we have a distortion here or a gap in the line. So everything needs to be contiguous, meaning that the edge needs to end on a vertex that has edges that are marked sharp. You can also end you can also end the marked sharp edges on terminal or non-manifold edges, or not terminal, terminator edges, or non-manifold edges like this. And or in this case, like this. So let me just play around with the pattern some more. Again, you can increase the resolution if you want, but remember that using merge, this is a non-destructive option, and the subdivision will be baked into the work mesh. So let us just stay with the current resolution of the work mesh. And if you want more detail based on the current topology or resolution, and also the size of the faces, then you can just lower the panel size. And in the panel cutter modifier, you can randomize the seed value. Randomize the seed value for the minimum and maximum offset. The offset here means the depth or the extrusion height of the panel islands. So you can just go back and use random panels using the mark only with the merge option, mark only parameter with the merge option, and or the new or in this case we actually need to use the merge option, because if we keep using new mesh, then you'll just be creating new mesh on top of the old mesh. So in this case, merge was the right option for this workflow. You can define the thickness of the bevel right here. So in order to shade this, you can use procedural shaders that does not rely on the geometry of the mesh to actually work, or UVs. However, you can set UVs for this using just this cube. So cube project, and I'm going to use the materials from random flow, and then assign the materials using creative flow. In this case, we're going to use a shader that has a texture on it. So our flow panel soft UV underscore UV, meaning that it will use UV mapping. Now let's just go to the material and edit the scale of the texture right here. Something like that. You can modify the intensity of the texture using the color ramp right here. And now this can function as a background model in your scene. And you can always go back and using random flow, using the mark only parameter with the merge option on, and remembering your settings with the presets, and then just change the design on the fly. You cannot change the depth value of this because these are only generating with this method and the mark only option. It is only generating the mark sharp edges. The extrusion depth is controlled using the modifier right here, and also controls their randomization with the seed value right here. So let's go back and try something like triangulation, 10 faces to randomize. And we can also do notches to get more details. Notches just creates like single face additions to the panel islands. So if you have like a panel island like this, notches creates faces, extra faces on the sides. It can add or subtract and creates extra details that way. And in this case, we're just going to use something like 2 and 5 for the triangulation. Let's increase the max panel size to something like 30 to get, or 40 to get larger islands. So smaller panel islands means more of them and more details, and larger values or higher values of the panel size means larger panel islands and therefore less of them. So let's set this to something like 660 to get more relaxed areas. So something like this. And I'm going to modify the offset here. Randomize the depth value until we get something that looks okay. You're gonna actually generate a, a different shade value for the islands. We can set this to 0 or the distance, merge distance to 0. And instead of using vertex color, we're going to use in the input, select geometry, and then random per island, like that, and control this with a colorama. So this works because with the merge distance to 0, um, like I have demonstrated earlier, this is composed of different face groups and is not a unimesh. If we set the distance to something like 0.001 from before, this is unimesh and there's only one island, so there's only one color. And if we set this to 0, the effect goes back again. The only problem with this is that this kind of technique doesn't respect the mirror or the mirror modifier. You can see that there is no symmetry in the color. So we're just going to use very subtle amount just to get rid of the uniformity of the color in the object. So this is what we have now versus if we're using uniform color. Of course, you can still use this look, but if you want subtle variations, you can use the geometry option or the geometry node, random per island, and control the result using color ramp. So you have our, or we have our non-destructible extrusion here, and we have our non-destructive pattern generator using random panels using the mark only parameter. The only destructive option here is the subdivision. However, if you're using something as simple as the cube, you can always go back and limit dissolve. Let's set this back to 30, play around with the subdivision. And as you can see, the pattern changes, the extrusion changes, and also the color changes. So let's change the dimension. For example, if we subdivide this, we're going to get this kind of geometry or resolution or topology, I mean. So we need to equalize, or we need to dictate the way that the subdivision actually subdivides. So if we're using this kind of topology now, this is how it will subdivide. We get even faces versus this one. So we need to use to set the topology before we actually subdivide it. Now we can use random panels, subdivide, and we get this pattern. We can play around with the, okay, we get this. And let me just set the, or lower the intensity of the color. Now we can play around with the topology. Oops, let's reset this. Actually, we need to do that before we actually subdivide. So if we use, or if you add more faces to a particular area, it will generate more details there. So here, for example, so it's generating more details here. And with this method, as you can see, you can play around with a lot of options. So let's actually set the bevel to something lower. As you can see here, it's actually creating some distortion. That is because we have uh, very low offset, or we are generating thin faces, really thin faces here. So we need to get rid of that by increasing the panel size to something like 10, or minimum panel size to something like 10, And also we can get rid of it by just using a different panel seed. If you see any distortion like that, you can modify the bevel and also play around with the panel seed to generate a different pattern. So that is our only non-destructive destructive method here in the workflow, which is the subdivision. We're actually merging the subdivision and also the triangulation. But you can get rid of the triangulation using, if you select everything and press Alt J and then press F9 and then set this to 180 degrees. You can change both by click pressing and then dragging down, and then you can change both of these values just like that. You can still modify the topology, for example, like this, to generate more details here, for example, and then reuse random panels without any increase to the subdivision, and you get that. Okay, let's modify the scale of the texture. Actually, I'm just going to edit the intensity and lower the contribution to the lower the contribution of the texture overall texture to the metallic and roughness of the model. Probably set the black to something higher to actually make everything more metallic. So the brown tint here in the object is actually from the HDRI I'm using. And with this method, you can generate a lot of patterns. So for example, this is your sci-fi crate in your scene. You can just replicate this and then create a new pattern for this one. So you get two crates that have a different design, and this one here, you have that. And then you create another one and then get rid of the existing subdivision or resolution limit dissolve. And we're going to prep the topology. So do not apply the rotation, so you can always duplicate clear rotation, and this will let you easily add the or add or subtract any topology or edges. Because if you apply the subdivision for this one, for example, apply the rotation and scale, I mean, oops, um, rotation, it's messing up with the mirror. So for example, if we have this, if we have the mirror applied and we apply the rotation, it's much harder to edit the topology, especially if you want to use the knife, because everything is angled, uh, not as it's no longer straight. You can apply the scale, however, just avoid applying the rotation. So in this one here, we can change the dimension of the object. I think we have something in the middle. Okay. Oh, the face get twisted. So straighten this up. Okay, I'm going to apply the set the 3D cursor here, and then set the pivot to the 3D cursor. Select this element, scale to the x axis, and press 0, and that will straighten the geometry. Okay, didn't straighten the geometry. Let me just repeat the action. Limit to solve, and I'm going to use quad slice to quadify this. Get rid of this, and then scale it towards that, towards the y-axis. Actually, why is it? Okay, so we change the dimension of our object. Now we can randomize a new pattern for it. We still have the modifiers there and also the material. So all we need to do is play around with the random panel settings. We can increase the subdivision by a lot. Just be careful. So what is the difference between using a lower subdivision and then generating more details by just decreasing the panel size? Well, it all has to do with the face, uh, the size of the faces. So, for example, with this subdivision, the the smallest detail you can get is this single face right here and this scale. So if we increase the subdivision, the faces get smaller, and also the amount of detail that you can get using a single face also gets smaller. Then you can just duplicate again and then select all the faces. Let's not use any subdivision and just use another pattern. Okay, so that is how you can use the random flow add-on with the panel cutter add-on. You can use it to generate different designs using just randomized patterns and the GNode modifier system. So if you ever get tired of looking at this, for example, just go in random panels. For example, you have exited the blender and you have this um, because random panels will not remember the same settings that you used when you closed blender. So you need to Just remember the preset that you use. So we used the square 100% even depth from before. And all you need to do is go to mark only and set the option to merge to use it again. Then you can play around with the other modifiers, except for these extrusion settings here. It will not work because all our extrusion settings are being controlled by the panel cutter geonode system. You can increase the subdivision, but remember that that part is the only destructive part of the process. As you can see here, this is a lot of detail. Set the panel size to 1. We can set the maximum panel size to something like 50. Oh, so with this combination, it will generate small details as well as areas that are more relaxed, and just play around with the panel seed. So let's use something like 150. So it gives us really relaxed areas with areas that are also very detailed. And we can duplicate this and then just reuse. We're not going to subdivide it anymore. Do not use subdivision. And we're just going to play around with the seed value or panel seed to generate a different look for this. And then you can also randomize the offset or extrusion height using the geonode modifier here. Okay, so that is the advantage of using panel cutters, random flows randomization with panel cutters geonode system. So that is it for this video. So I'm sorry for stuttering with my commentary sometimes because English is not my natural language. So the longer the videos, more um, the more mistakes I actually do with the commentary. So forgive me for that. And this kind of format with the long format videos with the live commentary is actually faster for me because I can do more in a day. I can provide free assets from my Patreon, work on my add-ons, and work on other stuff like maybe Blender tutorials, native vanilla Blender tutorials. Depending on the length of the video, like for this one, for example, this is too complex. I can do this using scripted audio, but it will take me a whole day or probably 2 days to do that in order to explain all this scope. I can't do it in 5 minutes for this kind of scope. You need to actually see the little movements that I do to actually understand the video. If I were to make a scripted video with this kind of complexity, it will take me 1 to 2 days, and that will, of course, greatly reduce the amount of things that I can do. So for some videos, it will be very short and scripted, and for some videos like this, it's much better to be long format. You can actually play this at using YouTube. You can actually play this at 1.5 to 2 times speed. My voice will sound funny, but at least it will be much faster. You can still understand me. You can turn CC. You can turn the subtitles on also. So I'll sound like a chipmunk, but the video will be faster. And if you're impatient and you already know some of the stuff that I'm talking about, you can do that. You can speed up the video. Okay. So that is it for this video, and I hope you learned something new with the add-ons. So I'm also starting to go back to the online documentation and finishing the all the backlog activities that I've left there. So yeah. If you have any questions, use the comment section below. And thank you for watching, and you have a nice day.